So there it is, the Halo module for the Lunar Gateway, the first habitation module for the first human-rated space station to orbit the moon, all complete and going through testing as I'm recording this. And according to the Trump administration, it's time to cancel this thing before it even gets started, which is a bit strange because this is what Jim Bridenstine said about Lunar Gateway. Jim Bridenstine, of course, having been the first NASA administrator that Trump appointed to spearhead mankind's return to the moon, this time to stay.
It's about having a sustainable human presence on and around the moon. In order to achieve that objective, we need a permanent command and service module in orbit around the moon. We call it Gateway, and that's fully funded in this president's budget request.
So if this space station was fully funded more than half a decade ago, how is it going to save the government and the taxpayers any money to cancel it now when it is so close to being completed? And we don't even have to wait for a launch vehicle to get this station deployed and to get astronauts on board. We already have everything that is necessary to get this station deployed now. Falcon Heavy is what is necessary to deploy the first two components, the power and propulsion element and the Halo module that you were just looking at. So why do we want to cancel this thing now so late in its development where it's really not going to make any sort of substantial difference from a budgetary perspective? Can this thing really be so broken that it has to be shut down at this late stage? Well, the fact of the matter is, it isn't broken, and I'm going to prove it to you in just a moment. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Bulletin. Gonna get especially angry yet again today, but before I go any further on this topic, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. My opinions on Trump's position, his policy when it comes to NASA, has nothing to do with Trump himself or my position on him as a president, a person, or anything else. I'm not trying to take sides against Trump or suggest that Biden would have done a better job or that any other president would have done a better job. I would have this opinion regardless of the president who implemented this policy. I was especially annoyed years ago with Obama when he decided to shut down the space shuttle program before the United States had any sort of viable replacement for it, leaving human spaceflight and America's access to orbit exclusively in the hands of Putin and the Russians for almost a decade, a decision that, very, very fortunate, didn't come back to bite us in the ass, which it very well could have. And I continue to maintain that Obama did a lousy job of timing the whole thing. I think the commercial crew idea that he had and the notion that the shuttle did need to be retired, I think all of that was probably correct, but the way he did it was just terrible. And the way that Trump is doing all of this is terrible as well. Cutting back on NASA's funding and reducing the amount of support that NASA has right now in adjusted dollars to the lowest level that it's ever been since 1961. In other words, before the time of the Apollo era, before funding was ramped up to NASA that allowed NASA to accomplish all the amazing things that it did, from, of course, landing on the moon, to the space shuttle, to the Voyager 1 and 2 probes, to Viking, to all of the Mars rovers that have come after it. All of these incredible accomplishments simply would not have happened without a lot more generous funding than Trump is going going to be giving to NASA, or at least he's proposing to give to NASA here in 2026. And then to make matters worse, the one particular aspect of NASA funding, that is to say human spaceflight, well, that got a tiny, modest budgetary increase, but everything that NASA has built right now to facilitate their access to the moon is being shut down. Everything that's complete and therefore doesn't require any more development budget, well, that's all being shut down and everything needs to start over again, funding entirely new developmental projects in order to give American astronauts, European astronauts, whatever, access to the moon. In my opinion, very short-sighted and something that is unlikely to have a realistic replacement, a realistic solution for at least another 10 years or so, given where Starship is in its developmental process right now. And aside from Starship, I really don't see that SLS has any sort of viable replacement. And also, the Lunar Gateway. That is another really, really short-sighted decision, because even though there were probably some viable arguments, and still are viable arguments, as to why the Lunar Gateway may not have been the best of ideas, it's nearly finished. The Halo module is almost complete. The first habitation module for the Gateway, the power and propulsion element, is nearly complete. And also the Europeans are closing in on finishing the IHAB module. The United Arab Emirates have taken on part of the responsibility. There's very little additional funds that need to be invested in the development and construction of this station. It's nearly done. And not only that, the station has many, many uses for mankind's eventual long-term presence on the moon, which are going to be completely sabotaged if the station is shut down at this late stage in the game. And there are many of my viewers who are going to disagree with me. Many of my viewers who are going to say that this station was never necessary. It doesn't serve a whole lot of useful purposes. It really puts the entire program in jeopardy, but I'm telling you, it's just not the case. A station orbiting the moon, a permanent space station orbiting the moon that is occupied on a regular basis, is something that's going to keep NASA on the moon for the long term, which was the whole goal to begin with. And not only that, it's going to facilitate mankind's expansion into the rest of the solar system. It's time for me to prove that right now. So before we talk about Gateway itself, let's talk about why it exists. The original Apollo missions all landed in roughly the equatorial region of the moon, and the orbiting portion of the Apollo spacecraft was in low lunar orbit and could only stay there for a short amount of time. It wasn't in a stable orbit. In other words, anything placed in a low lunar orbit is not very well positioned towards a long-term presence on the moon. Instead, if you're going to have something waiting in lunar orbit for a lunar lander to return to, you want it in a more stable orbit. And that is where the Lunar Gateway is located, in what's called a near rectilinear halo orbit. And this has a number of different advantages. First of all, this orbit is extremely easy to transition to. It only requires 250 meters per second, a quarter of a kilometer in delta V, to get from translunar injection orbit to this near rectilinear halo orbit. A tiny, tiny amount of fuel, and the same amount of fuel required to get from this orbit back to TLI to return to Earth. That saves a tremendous amount of fuel. And then the remainder of the journey to the moon is taken on by a lunar lander. In this case, case, Lunar Starship. If Lunar Starship had to take on the entire job, it would have to use not only all of the fuel required to get down to low lunar orbit, or LLO, it would have to also land on the lunar surface, then take off and get all the way back to TLI, and then all the way back to Earth and decelerate into Earth orbit, all of which would require far more delta V than a fully fueled Starship would have available to it. Whereas if you're just using Lunar Starship to set down on the moon and then return to the Gateway, that is a much smaller amount of delta V. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Starship couldn't do the entire job on its own. What I'm saying is it couldn't decelerate back into Earth orbit. It would instead have to use the Earth's atmosphere to decelerate, which means you would not have the luxury of transitioning astronauts out of Starship and into a Crew Dragon to land safely on the surface. You would have to rely on Starship doing its whole flip turn and that sort of thing, and hopefully getting astronauts safely back to Earth, which is something Starship's not going to be able to do for a very long time. Now, of course, some would argue that you can just put Orion into that near rectilinear halo orbit. Why do you need a space station? Well, what happens if you want to change your orbit, change the location that you want to land on the moon? To do this, you would also have to change the orbit of the command module orbiting the moon, at least if you want to change these landing locations on the fly, or perhaps execute several landings in the same mission. Lunar Gateway is well set up to do this, and let me explain how. The most important component of Lunar Gateway is the power and propulsion element being constructed by Maxar. This is the king of ion engines, the most powerful ion engine ever constructed. And ion engines, even though they don't generate a tremendous amount of thrust, they have a huge amount of ISP, meaning that they get a lot more bang for their buck out of the fuel that you give them. Meaning that if you were, say, for example, to put a Starship in the near rectilinear halo orbit to serve as a space station, as some have suggested, you would need the chemical engines to change Starship's orbit and to make adjustments to trajectories, or to simply make course corrections to keep the station on target. And every time you use those chemical engines, you're utilizing a lot more fuel than ion engines use. Now, of course, you could retrofit Starship with ion engines instead, but those engines would have to be a lot more powerful because Starship is so big and heavy, and that would require a lot of engineering, a lot of money, and it's just completely unnecessary when you have a space station almost completed and ready to go. So let's have a look at the station itself. Aside from the power and propulsion element, the Gateway has two habitation modules. The Halo, which, as I said before, is complete and undergoing testing, and the Lunar IHAB module, which is a larger lunar living quarters that also houses life support systems, cameras, and supports scientific research. That's being built by ESA and JAXA. No U.S. taxpayer money involved. In addition to that, it also has the Esprit module, which provides cargo space and also a fueling module to refuel the power and propulsion element when necessary, and it also will have large windows where the Artemis astronauts can capture stunning images of the Earth and Moon from deep space. And if we put a real-time camera in there, imagine the images that we're going to be able to watch all the time from Earth, because this station is going to be in permanent orbit. And the module you're looking at right now is the Crew and Science Airlock provided by the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center of the United Arab Emirates. Once again, no American taxpayer dollars involved. This airlock enables spacewalks and the transfer of hardware and science experiments from inside the Gateway to the vacuum of deep space. It could also be used as an additional spacecraft docking port. And that's going to take a considerable amount of time before NASA or anybody else is ready to establish a permanent base on the surface of the moon. However, this space station will be ready to accept passengers in the next couple of years. As a matter of fact, the Artemis 3 mission, in theory, if Lunar Starship isn't ready, could be repurposed to put astronauts on the Gateway for several weeks or perhaps even a couple of months as they get used to the systems on the Gateway and perform some experiments on board, as well as controlling robots and rovers in real time on the surface of the moon, conducting reconnaissance and looking for pockets of lunar ice before we permanently decide on a landing spot for the first Artemis mission, putting humans on the surface. There are so many uses for this space station. On top of that, it can be a quarantine laboratory for returning samples coming in from other planets. For example, the Mars sample return could go to the Gateway first in case it happens to be carrying any deadly pathogens, and allow the astronauts on the Gateway to carry out these experiments before an alien virus gets unleashed on the peoples of Earth. And most importantly, the purpose of the Gateway is to teach humanity how to survive in interplanetary space. Up to now, we have been surviving a few hundred kilometers above Earth's surface, still protected by the sheath of Earth's magnetic field. Sending astronauts to Mars without first learning how to survive in cislunar space would be akin to sending explorers out to the New World from Spain, as Columbus did, without first learning how to sail, say, to Ireland. It makes no sense. This is a great environment to gain the information, the knowledge, and the experience necessary to survive in deep space before actually trying it. And it gets even better than that. A recent paper that was released just a couple of weeks ago entitled "Advancing the Lunar Gateway for Multiplanetary Missions to Mars and Ceres" really expanded on the advantages that the Gateway can bring to interplanetary travel. Quote, NASA, in collaboration with international partners, is currently developing the Lunar Gateway, a small space station intended to orbit the moon. Initially conceived to support lunar surface operations and serve as a staging point for Mars missions, the Gateway's potential could be expanded to facilitate more complex multiplanetary expeditions. By advancing the capabilities of the Lunar Gateway, we could create a robust deep space operations center that would significantly enhance our ability to launch, support, and sustain missions to multiple destinations in our solar system. For example, enhance propulsion and refueling capabilities. To support missions beyond the Earth-Moon system, the Lunar Gateway would need advanced propulsion systems. Nuclear thermal propulsion or high-powered electric propulsion systems could be developed and tested at the Gateway. These technologies would provide the necessary delta-V for complex interplanetary trajectories while reducing travel times. Additionally, the Gateway could serve as a propellant depot. By leveraging lunar ice deposits for in-situ resource utilization, we could manufacture and store fuel at the Gateway. This would allow deep space vessels to launch from Earth with minimal fuel, refuel at the Gateway, and then embark on their interplanetary journey, significantly reducing launch costs and increasing payload capacity. And many of you may be asking, why not just set up a propellant depot in Earth orbit and refuel it from Earth? Well, because Earth has a gravitational pull 6 times more powerful than that of the moon, making it 6 times more difficult to get that propellant up to a refueling depot, meaning that 6 times the fuel is necessary to get the same amount of propellant up to orbit. Far more efficient to put these things in lunar orbit. Also, there's advanced life support and radiation shielding. Quote, long-duration missions to Mars and Ceres would require highly efficient and reliable life support systems. The Gateway could serve as a testbed for developing and perfecting these systems, including advanced water recycling, air revitalization, and waste management technologies. Radiation shielding is another critical concern for deep space missions. The Gateway could be used to test various shielding materials and techniques, as well as to study the long-term effects of space radiation on human health. This research would be invaluable in designing spacecraft capable of safely transporting humans to Mars and beyond. Then the assembly and maintenance of deep space vehicles. The Lunar Gateway's location in cislunar space makes it an ideal site for the assembly and maintenance of large, complex spacecraft designed for deep space missions. Components could be launched separately from Earth and assembled at the Gateway, allowing for the construction of vessels too large to launch in a single payload. This capability would be particularly useful for a Mars series mission, which would require a spacecraft capable of supporting a crew for several years and navigating complex trajectories. The Gateway could also serve as a maintenance and repair facility, allowing the spacecraft to be thoroughly checked and serviced before embarking on a long journey. Then you have communications and navigation infrastructure. To support a mission to Mars, an advanced communication and navigation infrastructure would be essential. The Lunar Gateway could serve as a hub for deep space communications, incorporating technologies like optical communication systems and CubeSat relay constellations. And finally, the psychological challenges of long-duration space missions cannot be overstated. The Lunar Gateway could serve as a crucial training ground for crews preparing for multi-year missions to Mars, Ceres, and beyond. Extended stays at the Gateway could allow astronauts to acclimate to the isolation and confinement of deep space while still being relatively close to Earth. Moreover, the Gateway could be equipped with virtual reality systems and high-fidelity simulators to train crews for various mission scenarios, including landing operations on Mars. This preparation would be invaluable in ensuring crew readiness and resilience during the actual mission. What are the chances of a Mars mission being successful without any of these things? Well, let me put it this way. Without an orbital presence to sustain a permanent presence on the lunar surface, and without a proper training ground for a Mars mission, I think that both of those missions stand a much greater chance of failing than if we just put this station, which is mostly built and paid for anyway, into orbit as planned. So after we've seen all this evidence, I have one question for the naysayers. Why is a space station orbiting the moon not a good idea? Why should we never have a space station in lunar orbit? Is that really the best way to go? I say it absolutely isn't. As you have seen in this video, a space station will not only make it easier to maintain a constant presence in lunar orbit, to say nothing of all the other advantages it brings to a long-standing presence on the lunar surface. On top of all of that, it gives us many, many other advantages in terms of expanding into the solar system, both in the short term, as we learn how to survive in interplanetary space for the long term, something that we have never done before. None of the astronauts on the Apollo missions went out into interplanetary space and therefore beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field for more than a few days. Their exposure to that environment was very limited. And even though a lunar base might be able to simulate a Mars base in many respects, it's never going to be able to simulate interplanetary travel, whereas a space station will. And that's just one of the many advantages that this station brings to the table. But in my opinion, the biggest advantage is the fact that we could have the Lunar Gateway occupied in the next couple of years, far before Artemis 3 is going to be viable. That is to say, landing on the surface of the moon. As much as I hate to say it, it's going to be a while before Lunar Starship is ready to go. In the meantime, we can occupy the Lunar Gateway and at least have a human presence in lunar orbit, tantalizingly close to the surface, and keep that presence there. Once astronauts are on the station, it's going to be very politically difficult to cancel it. After going through all the effort that is necessary to get those astronauts in the first place, and after they've had multiple missions where they've had to survive the rigors of interplanetary space, which president is going to want to make the decision to bring those astronauts home for good and to sabotage that station? They didn't do it to the ISS, and they're not going to do it to the Lunar Gateway either, especially given the fact that the European Space Agency and now the United Arab Emirates are heavily involved in the station. And perhaps that's where this station can be saved if Trump refuses to invest in it and insists on canceling the whole thing. If that must happen, well, ESA and the United Arab Emirates definitely have the resources to keep the station going. And if they did that, it would turn Artemis into a truly international endeavor, whereby all of the contributing nations would be adding a very critical part to the overall puzzle. Sure, Europe and the UAE and others are already contributing, but if they were the ones actually running the station, and if JAXA, for example, contributed as well, then they would be an enormously incredible part of Artemis, providing an expensive and ambitious part of the entire plan, contributing to mankind's long-term presence on the lunar surface, which, after all, is what we want to happen, regardless of how it actually gets carried out. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also remember the merch store is open until the 26th of this month. I have it linked in the description and also pinned in the comments. And if you can't afford one of those shirts, and believe me, I understand why that wouldn't be the case. It's not like they're overly cheap, but you still want to support the channel in some way. A little super chat or a $3 Patreon level support would also be very helpful. Or if you're not in a financial position to support this channel, I certainly understand, and I don't want you to support me if you're not in that position. Just like and subscribe, and I will be very, very happy indeed. So until next time, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.